Welcome to this third session of our webinar series on environmental and social licensing and enforcement during the COVID-19 crisis. Before I continue, let me remind everyone that there is simultaneous interpretation available by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and selecting English or Spanish. Antes que todo, les indico que tenemos interpretación en la vara.
Before we start, please know that we have interpreting available. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you can click on the globe and choose either English or Spanish.
Under the framework of the Regional Policy Dialogue on Environmental and Social Licensing and Enforcement. My name is Davis Jones, and I work in the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I am the coordinator of the Regional Policy Dialogue. If I may take advantage of the opportunity to greet members of our networks, both the international and the Inter-American Network on Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. As well, today we have a representative from Interpol's Environmental Crime Work Group. I also wish to thank all of our speakers and our attendees for making room in your busy schedules to attend this program. During today's session, we will focus on how governments and the private sector are exercising their discretion to recognize new realities that have occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic. But what I would like to start with is a little poll. I'd like to ask you all what that discretion means and what is appropriate. So if you would go to menti.com, that's www.menti.com, and enter the code 797584. You'll be able to answer this question about what level of flexibility is acceptable during this crisis. The four questions are whether you think that full compliance with reporting requirements, it should be expected of everyone, whether that's perfectly acceptable on the right or totally unacceptable on the left. The next question is, should industries be allowed to increase their pollution above normal levels? None, some, a lot, or completely uncontrolled? Should routine inspections conducted by enforcement authorities stop completely? If so, mark your answer to the right. If not, please cease and mark on the left. And finally, how should we penalize violators? Should all fines and sanctions be waived during the pandemic? Is that perfectly acceptable? Or should we continue penalties as if nothing had happened? Is that unacceptable? So please mark your results, and we'll share those in a few minutes. We will, our four panelists come from institutions that are very experienced in their field, so we would have enlightened discussions about the challenges and solutions they are implementing. Each panelist will have no more than 15 minutes for your presentation, and that will allow time for questions at the end. Please post your questions using Zoom's chat feature. We'll collect those and route them to Christian, the moderator, to answer at the end of the presentations. And so allow me to introduce Christian Perez, a consultant for the IDB, who will moderate the rest of our session.
Muchas gracias, Davis. Es un placer darles la bienvenida.
Thank you very much, Davis, and it's a pleasure to welcome this third virtual dialogue on policy dialogue on environmental and social licensing and enforcement in 2020 in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic. Let me begin by reiterating the message that David Jones just conveyed to you regarding the way in which we're going to be handling questions, which will be via the chat room. So please use that on our platform. So once again, please ask your questions using the chat. Also, be very specific and concise in your questions so that we can later on address them appropriately. Second, as far as the running order goes, to provide context to this current iteration of the dialogue, we will begin by listening from Joseph Milescu, Chief of Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the IDB, and then we will move on to presentations from the four panelists that Davis mentioned, including Kathleen Johnson, Senior Counselor at the Office of Enforcement and Compliance at the EPA, Ruben Verdugo, Head of the Enforcement at the Office of the Superintendent in Chile, Heather McCready, Director General of Strategies and Climate Change in Canada, and then Daniel Garcia, Counselor, Advisor at the Chamber of the Industry in Guatemala. Once we clarify this and reiterating that each panelist will have a maximum of 15 minutes for your presentations and that questions must be asked via the chat, and that at the end of the session we will have the possibility of opening up for Q&A sessions and specific, both general and specific to each one of the panelists. Let me now welcome Mr. Joseph Milescu, who is the Chief or the Head of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank. Joseph has been a specialist for safeguards and team leader for offices in Peru, Brazil, Guatemala, and Argentina. There, he supervised the projects on environmental, fishing, forestry, and tourist matters. Before joining the IDB, Joseph worked in the private sector in the interest of cellulose and paper, as well as in the public sector in Canada in human ecology, environmental impact assessment, and environmental policy. Joseph has a degree in anthropology with a master's degree in regional and urban planning from the University of Machin. Having introduced you, Joseph, the floor, or the cyber space is yours. Thank you, Christian. Can everybody hear me just fine? Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, bon dia.
First of all, I want to thank Heather, Kathleen, Daniel, Ruben. Es un gran gusto tenerlos acá. I'm going to follow in Spanish today just to change from last week and the week before presentations. So good morning, colleagues. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. Welcome to the third installment of our virtual regional policy dialogue on environmental and social licensing and enforcement. My name is Joseph Milewski. As Christian just introduced me, I'm the Chief of Environmental and Social Solutions Unit here at the Inter-American Development Bank. And I'm responsible for ensuring that projects financed by the bank comply with our environmental and social policies and minimize operational risks. Our unit provides supports to IDB project teams, executing agencies, and environmental and social institutions throughout the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. This week, we're continuing the dialogue on how environmental and social licensing and enforcement agencies are confronting the challenges presented by the coronavirus, by the COVID pandemic. This regional policy dialogue offers the opportunity for practitioners and experts for Latin America, the Caribbean, and beyond to share their challenges and examine solutions so that we can all learn from both successes and mistakes, especially as we seek creative ways to continue to reach our objectives of environmental and social protection in the context of the continuing pandemic. The first of the previous two sessions focused on virtual stakeholder consultation, where we heard about mechanisms to ensure citizen participation when it is impossible to hold in-person meetings or to travel to impacted communities because of the restrictions. The second session last week discussed ways to continue to monitor compliance and issue social and environmental licenses while maintaining social distancing. Both are enlightening discussions and encourage you to review the outcomes and watch the recordings if you couldn't attend. On June 25, a couple of weeks from now, we will host a working session with limited participation from our traditional RPD partners in licensing and enforcement agencies to discuss how these adaptations from our response to COVID-19 may lead to lasting improvements in how we operate. Then we will end the series with another open session on interactions with indigenous people during the pandemic. Many of these communities have very carefully limited contact with outsiders because the coronavirus could devastate their communities. Also, they often have limited access to the internet or phone service. So we'll examine how to ensure they continue to be involved in environmental and social decisions that impact their lives. Today, we will hear from the Enforcement and Licensing Discretion. Simply defined, discretion means that authorities may change their normal procedures during times of crises to provide necessary flexibility while staying within the legal mandates. For example, they may reduce inspections or allow permittees to reduce monitoring and reporting without fear of a penalty or sanction. In effect, the IDB is doing exactly this. We are doing virtual missions, for example, and we're changing our procedures during this period. I will leave it to our panelists to offer their examples and further clarification. Let's see what you think about the use of discretion. Davis, would you show us the result of your poll? Let's see what we have here. Okay, so if you allow me to interpret those results. The question was, what level of flexibility is acceptable during the crisis? ¿Qué nivel de flexibilidad es aceptable durante esta crisis? So, full compliance with reporting requirements reached a 5.5 out of, not sure what the maximum was. What's the maximum, Davis?
Maximum is 7. It goes from 0 to 7.
Oh, I see. So it was considered on the more of the acceptable side to still have full compliance, but with some leeway. Allow industries to pollute. That was pretty much unacceptable by all respondents. We only had 11 respondents though, so it's a very limited sample. And it's a bit biased because I responded too, so in case there's my bias in there. The third question, stop inspections completely, parar las inspecciones por completo. It seemed to be around the middle, 3.5 being the middle. So it's considered rather on the unacceptable side, but possibly acceptable to stop those inspections. Obviously, there are limitations in terms of physical inspections. And finally, no penalties or fines. So, de eliminar las sanciones o las multas is considered rather on the not really acceptable side. I don't know if I correctly interpreted those results, but that's quite interesting, and it's a good opener for this discussion. So, to finalize, the use of discretion is not without controversy, as we can see. And implementing agencies are often caught in the middle between demands from NGOs and community groups for strict, unwavering legal enforcement to appeals from industry to allow emergency operations and permit exceedances for uncontrolled emissions. It is difficult to find a middle ground. As we just saw, just about no question had sort of a middle ground, except for the third one, I believe. In fact, after publicizing how they will exercise this discretion, the US EPA was sued by several groups that claimed they went too far. I also understand that Chile's Third Environmental Tribunal has ruled that the Superintendent on Environment does not have discretion and must act if a citizen complaint has merit. I hope that Kathleen, Heather, and Ruben will speak about the reaction to their agency's use of discretion, along with how and why the approach was developed and is being implemented. We also have another point of view representing the Chamber of Industry of Guatemala, y bienvenido a Guatemala en esta discusión. Most members of the regulated community try to do the right thing, but what happens when it is impossible to comply due to issues beyond their control, like a hurricane or the current pandemic? Danielle will discuss what reforms, guides, tools, and incentives can help industry do the right thing during times of crisis. Sustainable development must continue to ensure progress and improvements before, during, and after COVID-19 is under control. We must be diligent in allowing economies to open, but continue to ensure protection and reduce environmental and social risk. I look forward to hearing how our panelists and participants have found that balance. Thank you so much. Back to you, Christian.
Muchas gracias, Joseph, por tu palabra.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your remarks and also for showing the results of this poll. And we will continue doing this throughout the webinar. At this point, I would like to welcome Kathleen Johnson, who is a senior advisor at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She recently joined the OECD headquarters office after serving as director of EPA's Region 9's Enforcement Division in San Francisco. Since joining the EPA in 1987, Kathleen has held a number of positions, including supervisory attorney in the Office of Regional Counsel and senior manager in the Superfund Division. Kathleen has earned a degree in law from the Baylor University School and a master's degree from the University of Texas. Kathleen, at this point, the cyberspace is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Christian. What a timely topic we have today. I know that for us that are working in our headquarters office and enforcement, it feels like in addition to our regular jobs, we have a whole additional bolus of work related to COVID. Things that we've never had to deal with before are just added on to all of the normal work that we usually do. I was reflecting back on the timing for us, and I think it's interesting to note that the first week of March, the senior enforcement personnel from the Environmental Protection Agency across the country were meeting in Denver. So the first week of March, we were all on airplanes. We all got into a large conference room. We all had discussions for 3 days. Then we came back home, and 10 days later, we were all working from home. So it caught us by surprise, I think, even though we had already had a number of cases in Washington State. I think we were still surprised that it was going to turn into the situation that it has turned into. So we suddenly had to deal with the outcome of this pandemic. And as we were all working from home, basically for headquarters personnel, those in Washington, D.C., that started the week of March 15th, we started hearing from industry saying a lot of people have to shelter in place. There are local requirements, there are state requirements that they have to shelter in place and they can't go to work. So we need relief from environmental requirements if we can't get our personnel to their place of business. So fairly quickly, we had to decide how we were going to deal with these issues. So it took about 10 days. Our political staff here in the agency and our career staff, I'm a career staffer, had a number of discussions about what kind of policy to put in place during the pandemic. And we ended up issuing a policy on the 26th of March that I think is fairly circumscribed. It's narrow. So what we ended up saying was, if a regulated company is unable to do routine monitoring and reporting, that they should document the fact that they can't do it as a result of COVID. So it's not just everybody stop, it's if you cannot do reporting and monitoring because of COVID, then you need to write that down, keep a record of it, And if at some point later in time, EPA looks at that situation and asks, why did you not turn in these reports? And you're able to show that the reason you didn't was because of COVID, then we would not bring a penalty action for that failure to do routine monitoring. That is the extent to which our enforcement policy went. We said that all industry needs to continue to comply, that if for some reason there was non-compliance, we would take COVID into account when we decided what kind of enforcement to bring, or whether there would be a penalty and the amount of the penalty. But we didn't say we would not bring enforcement. We also specifically said that our enforcement discretion policy did not apply at all to certain things. It didn't apply to accidental releases. It doesn't apply to criminal activity. Importantly, it doesn't apply to imports. And one of the things that we have seen, and I'd be interested in hearing from the other panelists, we have seen a huge uptick of violative pesticides. Pesticides that say they have EPA registration, pesticides that say they're good on COVID, and we have no information that reflects that's accurate. So we've actually had an uptick in enforcement for those kinds of cases. We also interestingly said that the temporary enforcement policy does not apply to drinking water systems, because we felt like it is absolutely critical that the drinking water infrastructure remain as strong as possible, including regular monitoring and reporting. So we set that out in the policy as well. As I'm sure you all know, we have a bifurcated system in the US where we have the federal EPA and then we have 50 states. Almost all of our states have also issued enforcement discretion policies of some kind. And when the federal government, when we wrote our policy, we specifically said it's not binding on the states. The states could either choose to follow what we set out, or the states could go a different direction. Because states have a smaller universe of regulated entities, many states set up inboxes, virtual inboxes, where a facility could write into the state and say, we're having a compliance problem, this, that, or the other thing. We felt like we couldn't do that at the federal level because our universe is too large. And we wanted to preserve the resources at the federal government for dealing with acute issues or issues that really impacted public health. So we did not want to have to proactively deal with routine monitoring and reporting violations. But many of the states have issued policies of one kind or another. As was mentioned, just about as soon as the ink was dry on our policy, we received a lot of criticism. We received a number of inquiries from our congressional representatives. There was a lot of press, and unfortunately, especially in the beginning, the press coverage was not accurate. The press coverage tended to say that we were standing down from enforcement, which is not at all the case. So there was a lot of information in the press that we had to counter about what the policy says and what it doesn't say. We have at least 2 lawsuits over the policy. One lawsuit alleges, or they said that this was rulemaking instead of a guidance document. It was rulemaking that should have gone through public comment. I will reiterate that we wrote this policy in the space of less than 2 weeks because we felt like we had to address the issues. People were, it was unclear what they should do and people wanted answers. So we felt compelled to get a guidance document on the street. We have also had a number of requests under the FOIA. What does FOIA stand for? Freedom of Information Act, which I'm sure you all have similar sunshine in government type laws. So we're being asked for every response that we have given to facilities that have indicated they can't comply. So it's been a very big deal, and we're working our way through it. I do believe that this is unprecedented, certainly for us, how you deal with enforcement when you are dealt with this situation where people have to stay home and they can't get to their facilities. So it's very hard to figure out the right balance, but we think we have. And now, as we're moving forward, we have to figure out how we adjust. So when we wrote the temporary policy, we said it's temporary. And as the conditions changed, we would look to revise the policy as appropriate. And now different parts of our country are opening up. Other parts are still not opened up. So we're in this phased process. And because the incident of the virus is varied depending on which part of the country you're in, we're ultimately going to have differences in our ability to get out in the field and do certain things. So it's been very challenging, and we've sort of had to figure it out as we go along. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues in other countries to see how you are managing these very difficult issues. Thank you, Christian.
Muchas gracias, Kathleen. Se escuchó muy
Thank you
clara.
very much, Kathleen. Your presentation was extremely clear. Thank you for providing the background to this temporary enforcement policy in the context of the COVID pandemic. And I'm assuming there's going to be a lot of questions, but let me reiterate, like we said at the beginning, that the Q&A session will take place at the end of all 4 presentations, and the questions will be asked via chat. Thank you once again, Kathleen. And now moving on with the structure of today's webinar, I would now like to welcome Ruben Verdugo, who is the head of the Enforcement Division at the Chilean Office of the Superintendent. Ruben has over 25 years of work experience. He worked, for example, in supervising analytical laboratory. He was also head of the metrology division at the National Institute for Standardization, and later leading the environmental health department at the Institute of Public Health. Since 2014, Ruben has been the head of the monitoring and inspection division of the Environmental Management Agency, and as such, his main roles include defining and fine-tuning national enforcement programs, coordinating with the services that are part of the National Environmental Enforcement Network with the programs and goals. He's also charge of the technical office, and he also provides assistance for compliance in SMAs, regulated agencies, in order for them to meet their regulatory features. He's a chemist, and he has a degree in environmental planning and protection from the University of Chile. Having introduced him, I would now like to give the floor to Ruben. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Good morning, everyone. I wanted to thank Joseph from the Inter-American Development Bank for this invitation. And especially I wanted to thank Davis, who has always been especially kind with our superintendency. And I am glad to participate in this discussion. I'm going to be sharing with you a couple of slides so that you can see what we have been doing, not only in the areas having to do with COVID, but also to provide you with a bit of background. Some of you are acquainted with it. In Chile, in October of last year, there was a major social crisis, a mobilization on the national level. And because of that, there were concepts, requirements brought to the fore. And if you look at this, you understand this new reality, a reality that was presented to us last year. And because of that, we have had to revamp the different actions that we've been taking and the actions we're taking today. So I am going to share my slides with you so that you can see what we have. Okay, discretionality in enforcement and licensing at the time of crisis. Here we go. As I was saying, beyond the pandemic per se, I would say that this is a cross-cutting situation in that we have a lot of mistrust. This is a reality. We have to address it. Our citizens, our communities distrust absolutely everything. They distrust their political representatives, government authorities, public institutions, the private world. So right now, this is a reality that creates a lot of tension, and that affects our work. For our work, we really do need trust in our goals, in our work, and I'm sure that we all are facing the same issue. This has to do with fake news. That too creates greater tension for enforcement agencies because to a certain extent, we do not have the wherewithal to decide what information is true information, what information is valid, and what information is not. So that creates a lot of tension regarding our role as providing environmental oversight. So we have this handicap, this mistrust, and that creates some tension regarding our own reality. And as I was saying, in October of 2018, Chile went through some civil unrest, and that caused a concept to be created in Chile. It's called Chile Cambió, Chile changed. And that means that different government agencies, private entities had to rethink the way that we relate with each other, how we have been relating with the community too, in practical terms. Now, if to that you add the current situation due to COVID, where one of the major elements has to do with physical distancing, maintaining a quarantine, realizing that this is a worldwide health event and that it's complex. All of this has led us to make some very basic decisions that have to do with the need to adapt. Traditional enforcement mechanisms may no longer serve us. We had been doing things that were suitable. We as regulatory agencies were used to the idea behind enforcement, and that is an enforcer goes to a facility and sees what's happening. So if they don't have those inspection visits, they may think, okay, I'm fine, I don't need to change. But all of that is changing because of the context that we're now describing. And this has to do with how entities like ours, enforcement agencies, have to quickly adapt to the situation that we are currently in. Now, in view of that need to adapt, what have we been doing? And first of all, this is a constant need for an entity like ours, but in the next few weeks, we are opening up the possibility of lodging a complaint online. The format that we have had traditionally, where a community would bring us a complaint, is no longer possible. So communities will now be able to lodge complaints in another way. Before, they had to fill out a form. They had to take that form to the superintendency. There was an important element, and that was that they had to come to our offices. So we have to get rid of that requirement, and that is probably going to mean that the action can be carried out online. And we're sure that that will cause the numbers to rise quickly. Now, a second bullet, and this too has to do from the October 2018 crisis and also COVID. In March of this year, another process began. There we issued a resolution suspending deadlines. We said, in view of the current situation, deadlines associated with penalty enforcement, other reporting requirements, all of those deadlines were suspended. That meant that we inserted some flexibility in what was on the books. As Kathleen was saying, this was almost immediate, just a few days after we issued the resolution. As soon as we issued the resolution, we got the same criticism Kathleen said. The agency is no longer fulfilling its role. Companies are going to continue to do what they've always done. And so that does create tension. And it's important to realize that that is a fact. No matter the thought that we put into the implementation of these resolutions, but we never thought that the first thing we would get was a complaint from our citizens calling for our action. And we were merely following our guidance in general terms. Also, requirements for information. As a matter of public health, we have complied with the different quarantines, and we decreased the number of inspections in the field. And also, we lowered reporting requirements. Those are the two mechanisms that we usually use for enforcement. So we have the inspection visits, inspection of the field, and there we do measurement, sampling, analysis, and then reporting requirements. So we began to require the information that we felt they should want to have available as part of their own systems, so as to not create the impression that we were no longer performing our enforcement role. In other words, we wanted to make it clear that this was not the Far West where everybody could do whatever he or she felt best. No, but we have changed our reporting requirements. We're systematizing that information right now because we need to know if this mechanism has been suitable. So, did we ask the right questions? Did we get appropriate answers from the people being supervised? So we have to look at all of those matters too. Then a fourth line of work was we issued some general instructions going to the different sectors that are regulated. One instruction was, ladies and gentlemen, please report to us weekly on your operational status. Have you been able to maintain your traditional activities? What human resources are you using in your different operations? And this is still being maintained. What we're probably going to do is maintain this instruction. We may ease the deadlines a bit about reporting every week. We may lengthen that period of time. And basically, medium and large enterprises have been providing us with that information quite well. They have been willing to report as we required. The sectors that we have received information from is poultry farming, mining, but other sectors have not responded to these requirements. Also, we have general instructions that move ahead in something we have discussed with the EPA in the past, and that is next generation compliance. We have tried to establish mechanisms whereby we can link information so as to gather information from the online monitoring systems, SIMs, and we have been applying other parameters. We have looked at pilot experiences with online monitoring for physical requirements, chemical requirements, for example, dissolved oxygen in water. Also, we are looking at capturing information that is online because that helps us gather data. And also, we are moving our enforcement rationale towards an attitude of prevention, of early action. So that is basically the way that we are working. Also, as I said, we're doing follow-up online. A couple of weeks ago, we launched a strategy that has to do with using monitoring and follow-up, especially with the water sector. And what we have been doing is we have been using satellite information so as to be able to ascertain the position of salmon producing in the sea. So we say, you're in the right place, or you are moving your site, you should be back into your compliance area. So as you can see, none of these mechanisms require our being in the field. That means that these are new mechanisms. Also, we have done some field inspections, especially when we have had to deal with contingencies, and we have taken all of the precautions. We have followed occupational health recommendations, wearing face coverings, doing social distancing with the party being inspected. And another thing is that at the end of an inspection, we always prepare a record of that inspection. And what we're doing now is that that record is sent the next day by email so as to avoid, to the extent possible, interaction with other people in the field, because we know that that could put our inspectors at risk. And then the concept. If you look at the concept, if you look at the purpose of this challenge, we have to somehow maintain the enforcement actions that has to be done, and we have to use technological tools. And conceptually, behind all of these realities, we're moving towards early correction. Now, we have been convening those that we regulate. We have been asking them for early correction plans so as to somehow avoid getting into the penalty phase. That is precisely the intention of the superintendency. So if you look at all of these elements together, you can see what we have been doing in practice. And that means that we have to be able to adapt. That is the whole idea. But if we look at the context, that would be an element that produces a lot of tension for us and between us and the community. And again, that has to do with the distrust. So we have to generate mechanisms for feedback, self-regulation. We have to make this as dynamic and as timely as possible. So that concludes my presentation, Christian. And I hope that this met your purposes. Thank you very much, Ruben. Plus, you were 15 minutes on the dot, so thank you very much. Also, to provide you with a bit of context about how you have been responding to the current situation in the SMA. And this included important social issues, and you talked about the measures to adapt to the pandemic. Issuing instructions, using technology as a response mechanism. This is an important scenario. And then your final thoughts regarding adaptation, but all of this reflecting the context, as you well said. So thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And continuing now with the structure of our webinar, we want to welcome Heather. Heather is the General Director of the Strategy of Technology, the Environment, and Climate Change in Canada. And she's a member of the Working Group on Crime of Interpol. Before joining the Science and Technology Division, she spent 10 years in the Office of Compliance, and recently she is the Underdirector of Compliance. Her experience includes, and this is an initiative to adapt the principles of police surveillance, the use of intelligence and applying that to the environment. Heather periodically gives talks at law schools, also at the Bar Association of Canada and the U.S. Association of Resource Rights. Also, she wrote a chapter called Towards Application of Environmental Laws. That is part of compliance and application of environmental laws. Heather graduated from McGill and graduated in common law, political science. And after that introduction, I welcome Heather. So Heather, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I hope that I can be as bang on 15 minutes as Ruben was. Given that I used to be a lawyer, I feel like I need to begin every presentation with a disclaimer. So I'll do that now. As Christian mentioned, I spent 10 years in the enforcement branch at Environment and Climate Change Canada, most recently as Deputy Chief Enforcement Officer. Since November, I've been with the Science and Technology branch, so I'm no longer speaking officially on behalf of the enforcement branch. But because of the various different roles and affiliations I have some insight across enforcement still for the Government of Canada. But these remarks are more informal, not formally on behalf of the government. And pretty much everything I'm going to be discussing is publicly available information. I'm just organizing it and packaging it for you. As Christian also mentioned, I'm still on the board of Interpol's Pollution Crime Working Group. In addition to that, domestically, I'm part of something called the Community of Federal Regulators, which is basically a community of federal departments that have a regulatory capacity. And as part of my work with the CFR, the Community of Federal Regulators, I'm the co-chair of their Community of Practice on Compliance and Enforcement. So this is giving me right now a line of sight over various different regulatory enforcement agencies in the Government of Canada. So that includes environment, where I still work. It includes transportation safety, food inspection, health products, a whole gamut of things like that. There are a number of points I wanted to cover today. First of all, how Canada is handling discretion and enforcement during the time of COVID-19. Really building upon discretion that already exists and common sense and reasonableness and enforcement that already exists. I think we're dealing with an incredible crisis globally, obviously, but the rationale that enforcement officers have, the way that they reason through different issues, that I don't think has changed. It's simply that the facts have changed, but the logic has not. So I'll get into that a little bit in my talk. And then there are some areas that I'm following as we go through this crisis, and we move from the initial crisis phase into living with COVID-19 and what comes after. So there are some areas that I'm looking for to see how courts in Canada interpret the discretion that officers use, and also the behavior of corporations. So I'll start by giving you a little bit of the context in which we're operating in Canada right now. So like everybody else, we've been dealing with the initial phases of the pandemic by greatly reducing the amount of interaction that our staff are having with each other and also with the outside world. A lot of our enforcement activity, particularly the proactive planned kind, has been curtailed for the time being, as different departments retreat to what we call business continuity plans. So plans that we use during a period of crisis. None of these plans were really designed for a sustained pandemic situation like this, so we're adapting. But in many cases, their proactive inspections have been shut down completely during this time as we figure out how to reopen those functions and keep our staff safe and also the public. During that time, close to the beginning, there was some communication sent out from one of our central agencies in Canada to federal regulatory departments, asking for departments to consider how flexible they could be with regulators during the situation, taking into account the facts of the situation, the fact that so many companies were not able to have their employees go on site, of course, and do the normal sorts of regulatory compliance measures that they would. Wasn't surprising to receive that communication. It wasn't a direction. It was merely a call and a reminder to be reasonable. But in the same context, our government still has a very ambitious environmental agenda, particularly an ambitious climate agenda. We're still going ahead with plans for our price on carbon pollution and other associated initiatives. So the context in which we're operating as regulators is one where we are trying to be reasonable, but on the other hand, the government still has the same priorities as it did pre-COVID. And we are continuing to work on those areas. So as part of its response to the COVID crisis, our government has been rolling out essentially a lot of bailout packages for individual people, for businesses, for different sectors. Some of those bailout packages have included green conditions, green terms. So companies that receive the bailout packages have actually increased environmental reporting and transparency that they have to do. So that's the landscape in which we're working. I'm going to focus now on the environmental sector because that's still the one I know the best, even though I'm exposed to lots of others now. Like the US, we also have a bifurcated system where both the federal government and our individual provinces have laws and regulations that, for the most part, are complementary. We basically split the environmental jurisdiction. And the way that the federal government is handling the situation is a bit different than the way the provinces are handling it, as my colleague from the US mentioned for America. For the federal government, we have informed industry associations that we will of course be reasonable and we will of course use our discretion to be as kind and understanding as possible about the real challenges that companies are facing and regulated parties are facing, but that environmental laws and regulations are still there, they're still in force, and companies still have to comply with them. For the provinces, it's really been everything from A to Z, with some provinces taking the same tack as the federal government, saying that environmental laws and regulations are still in force, but of course will be reasonable, to the province of Alberta suspending reporting requirements for companies for environmental this, as I mentioned at the beginning, using discretion in enforcement isn't anything new for anybody who works in enforcement. What you're doing when you use discretion is taking into account the context, the reality, all the facts around the situation to make a decision about what is the best enforcement action, if any, in a given situation. So within the environmental enforcement context, our officers do both inspections and investigations. And by that, I mean, we don't have the distinction that some other countries do of having a civil enforcement unit that issues administrative penalties or administrative measures, and then a criminal enforcement division that would take things from investigation to prosecution. Our officers actually do both, so it's a blended system. There are strengths and weaknesses to that blend, but one of the strengths is that officers have at their disposal the full suite of tools that the federal government has available for environmental compliance. So they're already accustomed to using quite a bit of discretion depending upon the circumstances. So that goes from deciding not to issue an enforcement action at all the way to investigating a case and bringing it to prosecution. So there's quite a range of activities that they can do. Within that, there are also opportunities for further discretion. So for example, when an officer issues a direction or a compliance order to a regulatee, compelling them to take certain measures, there's a period of time whereby the regulated party has an opportunity to make representations to that officer to say, you've asked me to do X, but the following things get in the way of doing that. It's not reasonable. And there's a way to modify that direction and compliance order. In fact, initially what's issued is a draft direction or compliance order, which is sent almost for comment, unless there's a very emergent situation where an officer is dealing with a crisis or a pollutant release that's happening quite urgently, where they may issue a verbal direction and say, you have to stop that right now. So officers are accustomed to listening to lots of context that comes from regulated parties. I've always been the most impressed with our officers in the North and how they have to deal with different realities. Far up north in Iqaluit, for example, there are areas where you can only access them by ice roads that only exist in the winter. So if we're asking a company to install certain treatment equipment, that equipment can only physically arrive there at certain times in the year. And so the amount of time we give them to install that equipment has to take that into account. So that's something that officers already do, governed by compliance and enforcement policies that set out the parameters of that. In addition to that, when a case goes to court, and this is an area that I will be following as we move through the initial crisis phase of the pandemic onto what I'm starting to call living with the virus and how we're going to handle this over the next couple of years. I'm interested to see how courts interpret the actions of companies during this time. So the majority of the environmental offenses in Canada, in fact, the majority of regulatory offenses across the whole spectrum of regulations, are what is called strict liability offenses. Many people in this webinar may be very familiar with that, but in a nutshell, just by the fact that the party has done the thing means that they are essentially guilty of that offense. We don't have to prove intent. So the officer doesn't have to prove that the party intended to do that, intended to cause the harm. The fact that they've done it is sufficient, but the regulated party has a defense of due diligence. So they can, again, I'm being very colloquial here, can bring forward information about how they tried to prevent that occurrence from happening, be it pollution, a pipeline break, something like that, what measures they took to avoid it or mitigate it. Ultimately, that is determined by a court if that defense is sufficient, but it's something that officers are constantly evaluating when they're looking at the behavior of a company. So I'm quite interested to see how courts end up interpreting the reality of COVID-19 and the constraints and difficulties that companies are facing with their obligations under environmental and other regulations. So I know that will be taken into account. In terms of how that discretion is actually operating right now, I'll make a couple of points. The first one is mainly that there hasn't been a lot of enforcement during the COVID-19 and the initial phases of the crisis. So over the last 2 or 3 months, there, for the most part, and I'm speaking now for all the federal regulatory agencies and what I've observed anyway in the many meetings I've been in with numerous agencies, is only the most urgent proactive enforcement has been happening. Really, it's in a sense, it's actually reactive. It's responding to a crisis situation, such as there could be, you know, a chemical spill or something like that. The proactive enforcement that's been taking place has primarily been in essential service areas such as food inspection. Food obviously being essential to all of us. Food inspection continued to be essential even during the early phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there has been more proactive inspections done there. But by and large, there's been quite a reduction in inspection activities during this time. So I don't think yet we've really seen the tension or the friction that I'm expecting to rise later on. Once we start to reopen, as we're working on now, and start to do a lot more proactive inspections and compliance verification, I'm interested to see, we don't know yet, what companies are really capable of doing right now and how our officers are going to interpret the actions that they've taken. Are they reasonable? Could they really not do the things that they required to do under environmental regulations? Or are they using COVID-19 as an excuse? And so that's something that officers will be evaluating. Along that line, one of the indicators that we typically use when we're looking at an industry or trying to decide where to devote our time proactively based on risk, one of the indicators we look at is if an industry or a particular company is in financial distress. That is often where you see increased non-compliance with environmental laws and regulations. That's one of the areas that tends to be cut when a company or an industry is in financial trouble. So that draws our attention to that industry to make sure that there isn't any non-compliance that's happening that could be creating a lot of pollution or other environmental harm. So it will be interesting to see as the months go on and we start to do more proactive inspections and the economic impact of this crisis becomes more apparent, what types of environmental non-compliance we see, the reasons for that, whether or not officers and courts accept that to be reasonable given the situation with COVID-19 or not. So that's an area that I can't speak definitively about yet, because I think we're watching that unfold right now. And I think all of you are probably also watching that unfold. So as I mentioned, I'm interested to see how courts interpret that. The other area that I'm finding much more positive, and I'm also watching, is the modernization that is happening as a result of COVID-19. Some of it's coming out of necessity, some of it's coming out of the opportunities that are presented in a period of disruption such as we're in right now. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the sense of permitting and licensing, unfortunately, you know, some of the systems we have in Canada are not as modern as we would like them to be. In some cases, to apply for a permit, you're typically submitting a paper application, or if you are able to submit something online, the regulator on the other end might actually have to print that and process it in a very old-fashioned way. And that is the case at a number of different regulators. Because we're all now working from home and licensing and permitting still needs to happen in some cases, there's been a real rush to modernize some of those aging systems to allow them to go online and be digital. That's going to help companies better comply without actually having to go into the office. It's going to help regulators do much better compliance verification, again, without having to go into the office for an extended period of time. So that type of modernization has actually been quite interesting to watch and quite positive, I think. The other area of modernization that I'm quite interested in and that I'm seeing evolve is how we do inspections, how we do compliance verification. And that was actually discussed quite well on a policy dialogue last week in this space. But in Canada as well, we're starting to do an experiment with many of the same things that the speakers from last week were talking about, including virtual inspections using UAVs or drones, virtual reality, connecting cameras that are on site with the officer. So some of those areas are really fascinating to watch, and it's been really positive to see how we're using this opportunity to improve some things. So I think that could end up making compliance easier for regulated parties and compliance verification easier for enforcement agencies. So that's a space I'm watching as well. In addition, another thing that I've been noticing that is relevant to the topic of discretion and is also positive is a real coming together of regulatory agencies. I've seen it happen domestically within the community of federal regulators, connecting the various different federal agencies that are part of that community to have discussions about discretion. We've had a number of those discussions. How do we intend to exercise our discretion during this period? What do we think is reasonable to require of companies? There's been so much more connection horizontally across that community than I've ever seen before. Typically, we're all too busy doing our own jobs to reach out and really connect with our counterparts. And so I'm seeing a lot more of that connection happening. It's also happening internationally. What we're doing right now in this space is a great example of that. And I think everybody benefits from that kind of coming together. So that is helping really create a logical space for the use of that discretion between agencies, so that we hopefully don't end up with a situation where one agency is being incredibly strict and rigid and others are being very lackadaisical. We're trying to sort of hit a sweet spot and a consistency there that makes sense to the regulated community and also to environmental NGOs and other stakeholders who have an interest in ensuring that we're doing our jobs. The last point I'd like to leave you with in terms of, we started with a question about how much pollution is permissible during a time of crisis. And what I think a lot of us are thinking about lately is what kind of world we want to build when we all come back to work, or when we all come back to normal. What is the normal that we want to come back to? At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, social media was lit up with all sorts of examples of reductions in pollution from simply the absence of human activity, waterways clearing up, emissions going down. I think, unfortunately, to a certain extent, that seems to have been a bit overblown when we actually have scientists look at it. Things have not been as dramatically better as we may think, but they have been significantly better. And so that has led to a lot of discussions about coming back greener, coming back stronger and better, but greener. And how can we rebuild our societies in a way that's actually more environmentally sustainable? Right now, it seems like the major conversation or topic on people's minds is social justice, particularly racism and policing. And when we talk about coming back stronger and building back greener, I'm also starting to hear discussions that are very positive about coming back more socially just. So when we are exercising our discretion during this period of conflict and crisis for a lot of people, I think we're actually setting the tone for the type of world we want to build afterwards. And if we completely vacate the space and say, when it comes down to it, the environment's not that important, I think we're actually sending the wrong message. So what we're trying to do in Canada is send the message that the environment is still incredibly important. But of course, we'll exercise those authorities with responsibleness and reason and kindness. And I will leave it at that and turn the space back over to the IAB.
Muchas gracias, Heather, por tu.
Thank you very much, Heather, for your presentation and for highlighting the context of crisis that we're living in and Canada's perspective in how they're facing COVID at the practical level in your agency, and how to reduce activity and personnel interactions, accountability, and also the compliance perspective from the point of view of the state, in the case of Canada, the federal level and state level. Also, thank you for addressing some criteria to take into account in discretion, for example, the reality or circumstances in which these situations occur. And in that sense, there are some things that I noticed, and that is that this is an ever-evolving situation, and we have seen certain opportunities, for example, to modernize certain aspects of licensing and permitting, as well as opportunity for improvement in some of our procedures. For example, everything that has to do with the use of technology. And finally, for those insights that you gave us in terms of what kind of world do we want to have after the pandemic, this new normal, what we want, what we expect, and how this discretion at the end of the day sets the tone, like you said, for what to expect afterwards. So thank you very much for your presentation. And now, moving on with the structure of our webinar, before giving the floor to our next presenter, I would like to reiterate that we are going to be receiving questions via chat. So please start thinking about your questions now so we can have them ready at the end of our 4 presentations and we can have the panelists answer those questions. So having said so, I would now like to give the floor to Daniel Garcia. He's a political advisor at the Chamber of Industry in Guatemala. He's an expert in sustainability and public management with specialization in solid waste, waste management, and watershed management. He has actively participated in projects in the South American region, for example, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, for the generation of renewable energy. Currently, he's a political advisor to the Guatemalan Chamber of Industry, as well as coordinator of the CACIF Environmental Commission, where he organized the private sector gathers. He's also a member of the National Council for Climate Change, member of the National Council for Science and Technology in Guatemala. Having introduced our panelists, I would like to give the floor to Daniel Garcia. Daniel, the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you very much. I am going to begin sharing my screen. I think it's been very interesting to hear this information from all the colleagues that... Can you hear me? Yes, Daniel, we can hear you just fine. So as I was saying, I am very thankful for this invitation. Personally, I would like to share the Guatemalan experience and tell you what's happening and how we look at this from the organized private sector point of view. Like the panelists that spoke before me have said, this pandemic is something that we were not ready for. And as a country, we are not an exception to that. As far as the agenda, I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific case of Guatemala. I'm going to give you some background to my country, also what we're currently doing in the COVID context, and as well as the proposals that we have received from the organized private sector. Guatemala is on its, I think, 88th day of a partial lockdown, and by that it means that there are certain industries and essential activities that are indeed working. We also have some background as far as how complicated the government handover has been. In January, the previous administration ended and we started with a new administration. With the previous administration, we had a lot of cooperation, and thanks to that cooperation, to an extent, we have been able to address the current situation because a lot of discussion spaces were opened up in order to be able to have proposals arrive from the organized private sector to the environmental sector. As a unique aspect of Guatemala is that we have a lot of informal activity. And because of that, there are a lot of companies that are operating under the table or that do not meet the basic requirements that come from the Ministry of Environment and other government agencies. The current situation is such that on March 13th of this year, we began this lockdown mandated by the government, but it created certain limitations that I'm going to describe as I go. The first is the National Environmental and Natural Resource Ministry suspended their work. And with the change in administration, I can tell you that starting in December and through March, there was like a partial shutdown of the environmental ministry for enforcement purposes because there was this transition to a new government, and therefore there's going to be a new work plan. For the organized private sector, that was very relevant, and it created certain chaos in the sense that we had a ministry that was authorizing and enforcing and licensing for exports and operations, having had it non-operational for several months, created a lot of difficulties. And then we got to March when we had the first case confirmed in Guatemala, positive for COVID. The environmental ministry shut down completely. So as a result of that, the government banned certain actions in order to minimize transmission rate in our country. So starting in Guatemala City proper, it started banning certain activities in the different departments. Now, what does that mean? That pretty much all labs, inspections, etc., could not send people from the city of Guatemala to other departments of states and vice versa. So a lot of this industrial activity that is uh, pretty much centered in Guatemala City versus the agricultural activities that are outside of the city of Guatemala, mining, hydroelectrical, and agricultural activities are farther away from the city proper. So it made it, and it still is making it really difficult to have these mobilization of staff from the city to the different departments or states. This created a lot of issues because unlike what my colleague from Chile stated, pretty much our ministry did not come up with an official position as to what to do in that regard. So the companies that are part of the organized private sector, at least in chamber and industry, that gathers over 1,500 companies, provided an incentive to continue abiding by the environmental commitments that are included in their environmental impact assessments. However, if we had to monitor wastewater or air quality or soil quality, it was not possible to do so because of those limitations regarding mobility within the country. And unfortunately, like I said, the Ministry of Health of the Environment, did not take a formal position clarifying what the rules of the game were going to be in that situation. And to this day, we have had several interactions with the authorities, and we were told that the idea was to continue with compliance to the extent possible, but that to the extent possible, as you can imagine, creates a lot of issues. In that sense, for 6 months now, we have been kind of inactive because of the change of administration, change in authorities, as well as the discretion that the people in the office have, because some people had certain criteria that they followed in the past, and now with the current administration, those criteria have changed. So there's no technical guide, for example, to assess the procedures for the people that either pass or fail any given environmental instrument, which of course creates a lot of issues and a lot of delays. In addition to that, the activities, the bigger categories, for example, uh, a water plant or palm facilities are suspended. Therefore, that also creates a lot of issues for the investments that are already taking place in the country, because everything has come to a complete stop until the restrictions are lifted. And this will be the Ministry of the Environment's call. The central government will have no say in this because the Ministry of the Environment made a decision not to follow up on categories A and B1 because of this public engagement. So our rules basically do not call for public engagement virtually or to be able to start this public engagement process as it is the case in other countries. Here, that is not the case. But another issue is that our law is back from 1986, and it says that all activities in the country must have some kind of environmental instruments in place. So that makes things complicated as well. The good news in the current context of our COVID pandemic is the implementation of a digital system that enables us to upload digital instruments, but that does not happen with enforcement. If we want to turn in reports, we have to physically go to the office in order to turn in these reports. There's no inbox, nothing. So this, as you can imagine, is a big issue for enforcement purposes because we cannot do it digitally. For this webinar, we get assistance from the US, which is very good, but it focuses on low impact activities. It doesn't have nothing, it has nothing to do with high impact activities. So those heavy investments in the country have no framework of reference. Now, from the private sector, we are concerned because we are trying to do all the necessary work to submit our instruments, and we believe that the Ministry of the Environment is in a position to digitalize their processes. In Guatemala, you do have to pay for environmental licensing, and you can pay for during 1 all the way up to 5 years, and you have to renew it. So the authority should have funds available. The problem is that obviously not everybody is up to date with their payments. Now, something that has been very well received, and it's a proposal, is that we, as a private sector in 2018, with the previous administration, had cooperation with the Ministry and Vice Ministry of Environment, and a proposal was made to have sectoral guidelines or manuals. We have 9 of them, and that makes it a lot easier to do a review by sector. We have it for textiles, for pharmaceuticals. There's several, 9, like I said, that can be pointed out as success cases. And the idea would be to do this for the 55 plus sectors that we have in the country. This is part of the mitigation sectors that mitigation measures that each sector has, and based on this, the authority may approve an environmental management plan and also proceed with enforcement or environmental audits. We also have licensing via web. This is a project to do everything online, which is going to help 70% of our cases. However, today we are doing the official launching, but there's a lot of questions as to how it's going to be implemented in practice because it will require certain changes to our regulations, and therefore it's important to have that coordination between the authority and the users. Like I said in the past, we need to have consistent criteria, which is not the case currently in Guatemala. The reviewer it is up to a reviewer to approve a certain environmental instrument following my criteria. Now a different reviewer might follow different criteria and decide not to approve it. So it is indispensable to have this licensing system. And as far as enforcement goes, that's also a concern. The information that we have is that only 1% of all environmental instruments that get to the country are assessed. In 2018, we had about 14,000 environmental instruments. However, in 2019, we had 30,000 environmental tools. And these environmental tools do not meet the timeframes. Some can take up to 6 months to get approved for low impact category. High impact category could be up to a year. So it's important to have consistent criteria through technical guidance so that we do the same for all environmental impact assessments and do all the enforcement. The assessment, like I said, must be digital. And for that, we are working on this web-based project, and as the organized private sector, we were able to provide our feedback, and we do not have the digital option for enforcement purposes. So that should be the natural next step for the current administration, that is to say, to find enforcement following clear criteria and not criteria that are up to each individual reviewer or enforcer. And then another important aspect are incentives, because incentives are also part of the private initiative. Why? Because it's a way of acknowledging the huge effort made by the formal sector. Last year, we had a success case in which 16 cases from the productive sectors were acknowledged by our president and the authorities for implementing environmental management activities that go above and beyond what the law says. A lot of exporters and industries have their own incentives, but they also comply with legislation from other countries since they are exporters. So these enforcement incentives should always be present and taking into account the economic aspects. This concludes my presentations. My presentation, there's a lot of challenges, but I believe that we are in the middle of a pretty complex context. The current situation is very pressing. However, the authorities, from the point of view of the private sector, we believe must implement actions as soon as possible for the benefit of safeguarding the physical integrity, the health, and natural resource preservation without stopping the activities that the ministry should take on. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel, for providing us a background information on how the private sector has faced the challenges as a result of the COVID pandemic in Guatemala. Also, Guatemala went through a change in administration, and that also impacted the situation, and in some aspects, it made it even more serious. We also talked about how the ongoing government actions in the COVID context gave way to differences between departments, and like you said, staff or equipment cannot be moved from the capital city to the departments, and this could have an impact, of course, in enforcement by impacting monitoring or environmental assessment or licensing processes. And finally, you gave us an overview from the private sector in terms of proposals that could be useful in addressing these challenges, such as changes to your legal framework, this development of best practices in different sectors, this web project that you talked about being currently launched in your country, the need for consistent criteria, and finally, what you talked about, these incentives. So once again, thank you very much for your presentation. And now, we have heard from our four presenters and Joseph during the introductory remarks, and with that, we're going to move on to our questions. First, we're going to ask a general question where each one of the panelists will have a chance to respond to that question. And that general overarching question for everyone is from your point of view, be it government, private, or what have you, could you please describe the main challenges that you have faced or that could be coming in the area of environmental enforcement as a result of the COVID pandemic? So we're going to follow the same order as we had for the presentations to hear the answers. So we're going to hear from Kathleen, Ruben, Heather, and then Daniel. So in that order, please go ahead and answer this question. Kathleen, go ahead.
I think as was mentioned, our enforcement historically has largely been based on in-person inspections. And we believe we've never really had all of the staff we need to adequately go to enough facilities. So in some ways, as has been mentioned, this gives us the opportunity to think differently, to do more off-site investigations, to use technology in ways that we haven't done before. I think Ruben mentioned what we used to call next generation technology, and we had a hard time getting people to understand that concept and to embrace it. And in some ways, this has really caused all of us to say, let's take a look at that. What are other ways of doing our work? So it's both a challenge and an opportunity.
Gracias, Kathleen. Rubén.
Gracias. Thank you, Kathleen. Ruben? Thank you, Christian. This is one big question. A lot of our conversation today will probably revolve around that. One of the major challenges we have had to face as Superintendency of the Environment is precisely this need to maintain a presence and give citizens what they expect from us. It is true that there are different realities of compliance in different productive enterprises. I would say that in recent times, we have been moving towards a regulated sector. The sector understands its responsibilities. We assume that they are responsible. So we see that the sector is relatively mature. It's moving towards a completely transparent environmental commitment. Now, having said that, I would say that what has been especially hard for us right now is the relationship raised by some of the other speakers. It has to do with the relationship between our entity with the communities, with our social and environmental surroundings, how all of this affects the role that we have. And that goes beyond the regulated agreements. So often we feel that people are raising their hand if they have questions, but basically, I think that we do have a challenge, and that challenge is how can we maintain our actions? Deliver what is required from a superintendency of the environment. So we see that tension between an oversight agency, regulated entities, and the community. So we're looking at how we can establish better linkages with the community through communication so that they can see that our actions are suitable, that there is compliance, and that we are seen as believable. So we want to be an entity that puts the credibility seal on many activities. Thank you, Ruben. Heather?
Thank you. So I feel like I'm going to be echoing the two speakers who went before me. I think we're all facing the same challenge of how do we adapt a system that is largely based on physical presence into something where we can do more things remotely and still have the same type of quality of work. So that's definitely a challenge in Canada. As I mentioned earlier, it does create a lot of opportunities. Like Kathleen and like I'm sure everybody else here, we never have enough staff to do all the things we want to do and go all the places we want to go. So one of the things that I actually get to experiment as part of my new job working on science and technology strategies is potential applications for virtual reality technology for environmental monitoring, which can also be used for environmental compliance. I'm not anticipating we'll turn enforcement officers into robots and just use drones and not real people. But I think that there's ways we can use new technology to expand the reach of our officers and really be a force multiplier. So fewer people can do more things, better quality things, hopefully. So that's something that I would have wanted to see even before COVID, and COVID's now pushing us into a space where we have to use that. I think the biggest challenge that I'm worried about is a challenge that hasn't happened yet. It's what's next. I feel like there have been big waves of things happening in the world, one right after the other, and I'm curious and a little afraid about what's going to happen next week. Part of me is so excited that we're in a period of just tremendous disruption, so that allows us to break down some of the negative things and build something better. And that's where I try to spend most of my time, mentally and emotionally. But every so often I just get really worried about, the hits just keep on coming. What's next? So for right now, our economy is fragile but stable and being propped up to a great extent by government bailouts and supportive measures and stimulus measures. I don't know how long that can go on for, and I don't know what impact that's going to have on other government spending, such as program funding. So it will be really interesting to see what plays out in the next 1 to 5 years. How long we're all really dealing with this virus, how long it will take to get a vaccine. But I'm going to leave it on a positive note, because most of the time I try to stay in that space. I'd rather spend much more time thinking about all the opportunities this is creating by breaking down a lot of barriers.
Muchas gracias, Heather. Ciertamente parece una buena aproximación enfocarse en lo positivo.
Thank you, Heather. That's a very good approach to focus on the positive and to be forward-looking. Daniel? Yes, Christian. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear your question. I heard the answers given by my colleagues, but I lost the audio temporarily, so I did not hear the question. Yes, I wanted to hear from the different actors. What are the major challenges that you're facing in the area of enforcement, difficulties that are related to COVID-19? And as I was saying in my remarks, I think that setting COVID aside, doing an enforcement of only 10% is too low. I'm talking about the environmental impact assessments. This is important for the current administration. We have to see how we can migrate towards digital models where we can do enforcement in that way. In Guatemala, obviously, we do not, or we haven't made all of the advances that we hear about from other countries, where we have a digital system, a truly robust ministry. I think that the Ministry of the Environment in Guatemala is probably at the bottom of the list in terms of funding. So enforcing has become very complicated. But we do think, from the standpoint of the private sector, that this is a very good opportunity to establish the groundwork, to have a model for enforcement. And I hope I'm not repeating myself, but it should be a model following technical criteria. It should not be customized, personalized. There has to be a clear criterion on how to do enforcement. And that is why we think that sector environmental guidance is the key, establishing clear rules and showing what standards are going to be used for enforcement. Thank you very much, Daniel. We do have some general questions, and that's really good, because in that way we can address them to one of the 4 panelists. And I will try to get the questions answered in order. Since greater flexibility is producing uncertainty amongst regulated agencies, the question is, how are you dealing with the questions you receive from the regulated entities, especially emphasizing legal matters? Kathleen?
So it's a great question, and it depends, obviously, on the specific situation. So where we have an existing agreement with an entity and there's non-compliance, usually that agreement addresses what to do where there's non-compliance. And so there's a conversation that happens between the agency and the regulated party. If there's not an existing agreement and it's a regulation that's violated, it's sort of the same thing. There's a conversation that happens, and as Heather mentioned, there's a lot of discretion already that the agency has in dealing with a specific situation. So in general, we look at the degree of non-compliance. Why did the non-compliance happen? And this is critical to whether, was it really COVID related, or was that an excuse for intentional non-compliance? And of course, our penalties are higher for intentional non-compliance and can include criminal penalties. So it's case by case, and it's looking at all of those factors that enter in. I would say the main thing we are seeing is requests for extensions. So not necessarily we need to violate or we need to exceed our penalty limits, but it is more, we have a document due in 4 weeks, can we make that 8 weeks? And so we're seeing a lot of that, and I think we're pretty open to extending schedules.
Gracias, Kathleen. Rubén.
Thank you, Kathleen. Ruben? Thank you, Christian. I agree with Kathleen. It does depend. It's case by case. The aspects that we have been dealing with in the superintendency in this area, we have been trying to reduce all of these uncertainties as much as possible, uncertainties that exist in each case. And we have emphasized our actions to promote compliance. And what we have been doing is we have dialogues with the different productive sectors so as to provide greater clarity on what is required to continue to operate, to continue to comply in these current circumstances. So as I was saying, this is something that depends, it's case by case, but overall, we, in dealing with the productive sectors, talk about the elements that are on the table. And as I said in my remarks, we do early correction, early remediation, what can be made better. But in areas where we can provide some flexibility, we have granted that flexibility. Now, one thing that we are clear on, there is no room for a lack of compliance. Thank you, Ruben. Heather?
One of the benefits or drawbacks of being the third speaker is I can pretty much just say ditto. So I'll agree with both of them, with Ruben and with Kathleen. How we're answering those questions, again, I'm not officially responsible for that anymore, but I'm still quite friendly with those who are. And we're responding very carefully on the advice of lawyers when it comes to the actions of actual enforcement officers. We are used to operating in a context where there are all sorts of extenuating circumstances, and officers take those into account. So these are different facts, but the same logic applies. The same assessment of the truth of the claims the regulated party is making, that same assessment is happening. Whether it be, we can't complete this thing by this time because we live way up north and we can't get the equipment in there, as the example I used earlier, or similar argument can be made in a COVID situation. We could not do X because of Y. We're still going to be evaluating the veracity of that claim. And in some cases it may be valid and discretion may be warranted, and in other cases it may not be valid. So I think I keep coming back in my work to the fact that the facts may be extraordinarily different, but logic and reason is the same. So we can continue to apply that in the same way, just looking at new facts. And I think that will hopefully take us through whatever is the what next. So once we're done with this pandemic, I hope this helps us be more resilient in the future and be able to deal with other extraordinary facts in the same reasonable way.
Muchas gracias, Heather. Daniel, tu mirada.
Thank you, Heather. How about you, Daniel, your vision from the private sector vantage point? Thank you. In my case, too, as everyone else has said, we have to look at this case by case. In the private sector, we have indicated that it's very important, to the extent possible, to continue to honor the commitments. Obviously, not all industries are up and running, but there is the commitment. With several corporations, we have said, okay, the plant may not be operating, but the environmental commitments remain. So it's important that the staff in charge of the environmental commitments be carrying out whatever actions are feasible, and they have to keep a log, hopefully a daily one, on the actions they are taking. For example, if they're working with a community, we have actors that continue to comply with their environmental commitments, even though they're not operating. And in the case of a pandemic, it's complicated because they have to continue to honor all of their environmental commitments, even if they're not operating. So this is a very interesting question because it does have a legal aspect. We have asked the authorities for an official position coming from the authorities. Now, we as private sector, once we get that official guidance, we're telling our members that the main thing is that we continue to honor environmental commitments by keeping a daily log, even if the company is not operating. Thank you, Daniel. We do have some general questions that can be answered by all of our speakers. Another question that goes to all of you. How are these systems that are being developed, how are they communicating with the regulated entities? This information on regulations, on reporting requirements, how are they being made public? How have the different countries tackled this? How has this been received by the regulated community? Kathleen?
That's a very interesting question. Our temporary policy is a public document, and it's very well known that we had this document. It's on our website. We issued a press release when we issued the document. We have been providing a number of frequently asked questions on the website, but we haven't had that much dialogue with industry over it. And to be honest, I think there's a lot more comfort from the industry side than there is from the NGO side or the Enviro side, the folks that are suing us over the policy. So I wouldn't say we're having a lot of dialogue around it at this point, because we very quickly were sued over the policy, and so now we're kind of in a litigation mode. I hope that that doesn't continue very long. As the other panelists have said, who knows how long some aspect of this situation is going to remain. So I hope that we end up having more dialogue in the future, but I feel like there's not been very much of that at this point.
Muchas gracias, Kathleen. Rubén, por favor.
Thank you, Kathleen. Rubén? Christian, regarding your question, the first type of action is we resort to our website, and there, through different communiques, we talk about the resolutions, the mechanisms, the measures that have been taken. On the website, as you know, we have on NIMFA a platform where we communicate not only with regulated entities, but with the whole community so that they can be brought abreast of our actions. Then another way to communicate with everyone is the general instructions. In that way, we talk about instructions for a given area. And something else that I mentioned a few minutes ago has to do with meetings with different productive sectors. There, we try to answer the more specific questions. So in that way, we have created linkages to our environment, but also, and this has been going on for a year now, we're using Twitter as a way to relate to the public. Of course, this has its pitfalls, but we use Twitter too. Now, just to conclude, I think that what Kathleen just said is very important. Just to draw a comparison, this issue has to do not only with how we relate with regulated entities, but how we relate to our community. Thank you, Ruben. Heather, please.
So in terms of official communication with the regulated community, there hasn't been a lot of that during the initial phases of the pandemic response in Canada. For the federal government, particularly in the early days, so in the first month or two, there was an official communications policy that pretty much all of the communication coming out of the federal government was going to be about COVID-19 and nothing else, and directed through certain official channels, such as our chief public health officer. The point of that was to assist with some of there's an information cacophony that people get with sources all swirling around. And during a crisis like this, it's really important that people have one clear message about what to do. So there hasn't been official proactive communication on anything other than COVID-19, with a few exceptions. So communication with regulated parties has primarily been through responding to requests, as opposed to any broad statement put out by the federal government about specific areas other than COVID-19. That's starting to change a little bit as we move from initial crisis response into reopening or figuring out how to live with the virus. But in general, there hasn't been a lot of communication, so I don't have a lot to say on this. But as I mentioned earlier, there has been a significant increase in communication, within departments. We of course have our own silos within our departments that don't often speak to each other, and then between departments. There has been so much communication, which has really, really helped all of us in our responses to this. Be it old-fashioned, let's just get on a phone call, to lots and lots of video chats. I spend most of my day on video chats, to other tools such as Slack, MS Teams, chat streams. So that has opened up lots of other ways to communicate. Again, I'm hoping that carries forward after our pandemic response and into how we do business with each other and also with the public.
Muchas gracias, Heather. Daniel, por favor.
Thank you, Heather. Daniel? In our case, here in Guatemala, we approached the authorities and asked them to open their offices by appointment because the offices were completely closed. So there was no communication with users. There was no way to be able to approach to get to the ministry. So we suggested that they open up email communication, phone communication, so that we could get to them, and so that we could begin to present files, ask questions, etc. But as has already been said, it's not only environmental impact. There are other agreements entered into by the country. We have to comply with those agreements. So it's important that they open up the possibility of asking them questions or refer to those licenses. So what we did was we made available to all of our members a webinar. We had a webinar with the Vice Minister of the Environment. And in that way, he was able to talk about all of the measures, answer all of the questions. We had 300 or 400 companies that took part in that meeting. And in that way, we made this information available to our members and to others too. It was free of charge. And in that way, everyone was able to hear about the new measures, the new provisions from the ministry. I wanted to thank you, Daniel, and all of the panelists. We have a few minutes left. We have a lot of questions. We're going to try to follow up on them on the bank's website. And also, we will be posting not only this webinar, but the previous webinars too. So just to wrap up, before I call on Joseph and then Davis, I think that we have heard about how everyone is reacting to an unexpected situation, COVID. Because of this, we have had to generate policies, procedures in both the public and the private arenas. The main thing is that these measures have not been implemented without some criticism. Also, there was discussion of possibilities of improvement and how different alternatives are coming from the private sector. Our Q&A gave us different ways of adapting, of being flexible, the importance of considering legal aspects, and also communication mechanisms between authorities and the regulated communities and other interest groups. And then lastly, we talked about how this has to be related to the digital platforms, different tools that may be available, Twitter, etc. So once again, I want to thank the panelists. And with that, I give the microphone to Joseph. He has some closing remarks, but that will be followed by Davis, who will wrap up our meeting. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you on the next webinar. Thank you, Christian. Thank you for your mastery with these webinars. This is an effort on the part of the IDB where we try to bring together the practitioners in different areas.
I think it was a very interesting case. We've had perspectives from the extreme north of the Americas to the extreme south of the Americas, from Canada to Chile, the private sector, from public civil servants, from the multilateral banks. It's been very interesting to see this. One thing that is very obvious from all of us, and that's a personal perspective, but we're all working very hard, and we're actually working harder now, I find, than during normal times. And I think it has to do with, in part, with the commitment that all of us have towards our responsibilities in terms of the environment and in terms of the society. So thank you all. Thank you, Kathleen, Heather, Danielle, Ruben, por sus colaboraciones, for your inputs, your insights, and your experience. This has been an excellent webinar. Thank you so much. Davis, for organizing this. Thank you, Davis.
Thank you, Joseph, and all of our panelists and participants. As you see, we got far more questions than we could get to. We will try to get answers to those and post them up on our website to share with everyone. I'll share that with you. If you, it will take us a few days, but you can go to either of these websites to look up the presentations, watch the recordings of the presentations. Please share those with colleagues that were not able to attend, and we will try to get the questions answered in a short written format. If you have any questions or concerns, I've posted my email up there, williamj@iadb.org. Feel free to follow up with me. Once we get the list of participants, we will send you follow-up messages with these websites and invitation to our next events. So thank you very much. And with that, I think we can close.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Muchas gracias.
Yeah.
Thank
Good
you.
luck. Stay safe. Stay sane.
Chao, gracias.
Bye bye, chao.
Hasta luego. Mucho gusto, Daniel. Hasta luego. Luis Manuel, gracias. Y a todos.
Thank you, Luis Manuel.
No, encantados de ayudarte desde aquí. Tu equipo buenísimo también. Joseph,
It was great working with you and your team.